Hi friends, welcome to the War Heroes channel. Today, we will talk about the memoirs of Friedrich Paulus adjutant Wilhelm. He fought with Paulus until he was captured in 1943. Let's try together to understand the reasons for the defeat of Paulus' army in Stalingrad. Everything was ready for the handover. The messages from the Army High Command had been clamped together in a folder. These interested me most of all. That is why I had asked the lieutenant colonel to tell me about them. I will go over them in detail in the next few days. My deputy took the folder. Let us begin with the curious ones. Several weeks ago, Führer headquarters sent us a well-known battlefield painter from Leipzig. He was to record the Battle of Stalingrad in sketchbooks and on canvas. We sent him to General von Seydlitz, as he could best place him at focal points. The painter is to do preparatory work for a vast picture that he will paint in his Leipzig studio for Hitler. Can we be responsible for the risks he will encounter at the front? The painter, an old man, is wearing field gray uniform. He should already be busy at work. Perhaps you will have the opportunity to discover for yourself on a trip to the List Corps, replied the lieutenant colonel. Right, carry on, I urged him. When you gave me your impressions of the homeland on your return from the airfield, I was reminded of a recent decree from Führer headquarters, by which we must constantly nominate soldiers, non-commissioned officer and young officers who display bravery in the battle for Stalingrad for the Knight's Cross, or the German Cross in Gold, and send their names to Hitler for confirmation. The first of these, a second lieutenant, returned 4 days ago. He told me that Hitler had received him very jovially. Finally, he had given an account on the radio about his experiences at the front, which was extraordinarily highly honored. The daily newspaper brought out his report with his picture. The propaganda at the front was not far behind. In the Kiev Soldiers newspaper appeared running descriptions of the battle from the pen of specialist Fritzsche. In any case, there is some method in this. As long as we don't have Stalingrad, something has to replace it, even if it is only refined propaganda. My impression is that many people at the front and back home are no longer attracted to it. The number of people tired of the war is immense and grows daily. Certainly the final taking of the city will bring about a change of heart. There is also a letter from the Army High Command along the same lines. On Hitler's suggestion, a Stalingrad shield is to be made, like the Crimean shield and the Narvik shield. The army has been tasked with producing the design for a memorial plaque by the 25th November. At this point, the door opened and Paulus came in. We stood up. Sit down, gentlemen, I won't disturb you. As I was going past outside along the road, I heard from Senior Sergeant Major Kepper that you were still working. What is that letter you have in your hand? I passed him the letter about the Stalingrad shield. A sad chapter. We have hardly taken half the city and battered through the rest with our heads. With the present fighting state of the troops, it is hard to see us ever attaining the set goal. But they give hardly any thought to that at the High Command. Instead, they bring up such trivial matters as a Stalingrad shield. After a short pause, the general went on. It will interest you, Adam, that an artist from the propaganda company has already made a draft. You will have to work on the award proposals later. I already have a horror of it, General. However, I am more impressed by how little progress we have made. When I flew off to my cure 5 weeks ago, I was hoping to see upon my return that the headquarters would no longer be here. On the contrary, everything remains as it was. I have not experienced anything like it in the 3 years of this war. You know yourself that in most of our divisions, the fighting strength of the regiments has sunk. But that is not the only reason. The ability of the Red Army soldiers to hold on has reached an extent in the last weeks that we had never expected. No soldier or officer speaks today of even in disparaging terms, which used to be quite normal. The Red Army soldier is proving himself more from day to day as the master of close-quarter fighting, in house fighting, and in camouflage. Our artillery and air force virtually plowed the enemy out of occupied ground before every attack. But as soon as our infantry leave cover, they are hit by destructive defensive fire. Should we be successful in taking a place, the Russians immediately counterattack, throwing us back to the starting point. Reflectively, Paulus looked up and then continued, Moreover, the enemy leadership has become more single-minded. We have the impression that he will hold on to his positions on the west bank of the Volga at all costs. In some places, the strips occupied by him are only 100 to 200 meters wide. If prisoner of war reports can be believed, the 62nd Army's headquarters are in the steep slopes of the West Bank. Since the middle of September, General Trukov has been commander-in-chief of this army. Again and again, he was able to bring new divisions forward over the Volga. His fighting strength grows. Ours fades away. The 5 engineer battalions flown in by air suffered such severe losses in the northern part of the city that we had to withdraw them from battle. Certainly, the enemy has enormous difficulties. Prisoners tell us that the 62nd Army is supplied at night over the Volga. As the army has hardly any vehicles or horses available on the West Bank, weapons, ammunition, and food have to be carried from the landing places to the positions. The troops have no rest day and night. The wounded and sick are taken across to the East Bank in the unloaded boats. Until now, it has not been possible for us to take the landing places or disrupt the water passage. But these are the same people, General, that we were driving before us for months. How can one explain this bitter resistance? I have already said that their command is assured of victory. General Trukov seems to be a very energetic troop commander. The time had passed quickly. We escorted the commander-in-chief to the village street, which was already completely dark, with an orderly officer who was waiting for him. Paulus went to the little house that he occupied. We, however, went back to work. The lieutenant colonel picked up the file that he had prepared for the handover. I would like to mention another of the Army High Command's measures. You two described how in Berlin, similarly to Vinnytsia, wishful dreams have replaced reality. In the first days of October, an engineer general reported to 6th Army headquarters with a fortress senior construction staff, 2 engineer regimental staffs, 6 engineer battalion staffs, and a construction company. The Army High Command had instructed them to construct fortifications in Stalingrad. Our chief engineer, Colonel Stell, blew his top when he heard. To build bunkers, one needs cement, gravel, and wood. It could be that one could get gravel out of the Volga or Don. Cement and wood must be transported for hundreds of kilometers. Even if that worked, we lacked the necessary construction workforce. The close fighting in the city has also strongly involved the engineer battalions. Finally, the Russians would not sit and do nothing while we built concrete fortifications. My deputy recounted further that Sell had proposed to the 6th Army's chief of staff that the engineers should be set to constructing rear positions. The Army High Command abruptly turned down these proposals. Naturally, no building material for bunkers appeared. Now, a new Führer order demanded that these engineers should build heated bunkers for the tanks, which was equally unrealistic. I can vividly imagine how Sell reacted to such fantasy, I said. All that you have just reported is, in view of our complicated situation, plainly depressing. The lieutenant colonel looked at me quizzically for a second. You know, Colonel, that I came from the Army High Command's personnel office. There I was several times astonished at the criticisms of the High Command uttered by the older commanders. During the 5 weeks that I have been standing in for you, I have realized what damage nonsensical measures and orders from the Army High Command have done to the troops. So it is, I replied, in this way that trust in the High Command has been put to a severe test. It would be good if the officers of the general staff responsible for such orders had worked for some months in an army headquarters. Perhaps they would then at last realize how dangerous it is if one starts off with false calculations in commanding troops. The gentlemen in Führer headquarters have studied military history, operations results, strategy, and tactics. Theoretically, they are fully aware that a battle has never been won by underestimating the enemy and overestimating one's own forces, and that the troops have to pay with blood for the command's mistakes. I must openly state that as a result of my experiences in the Eastern Campaign, a considerable part of my once high regard for the general staff has vanished. It would be good if after your return to the personnel office you could pass on your observations to a competent office. Or do you intend to take over one of our regiments? This prospect remains as before. My role on the general staff has reinforced my decision. There is a regiment free in the 76th Infantry Division. Colonel Abraham is ill. General Rodenberg has asked for a replacement for him. Here is the letter. I read the piece of paper. The illness does not appear to be too serious. General Rodenberg has suggested he be given command in the rear area for a few weeks. We will discuss that shortly, but before that, another question. How are things with our potential officer school in Suvorovsky? Unfortunately, we were unable to start the course on the prescribed date. The fighting within the city forced us to delay its assembly. Captain Gubbo was only able to start the instruction in the middle of this month. That did not please me at all, for we urgently needed young infantry officers. I could not reprimand my deputy, for he was not responsible for the delayed start. I decided to do everything I could to speed up the instruction. Then I had a thought. How would it be if Colonel Abraham was ordered to Suvorovsky? He could recover there while at the same time advising Captain Gubbo in the educating and training of the officer cadets. You yourself could take over Abraham's regiment. I am agreeable to that, Colonel. Would Generals Paulus and Schmidt agree? We will go to the conference together tomorrow morning and take the written application to the Army High Command for your transfer to the 76th Infantry Division with us. If all goes well, you could take over your duty in 2 days' time. Then I had to tell him another secret. In my last visit to the personnel office, I had brought up the subject of my relief as adjutant. Should General Paulus be agreeable, Colonel Sommerfeld, in peacetime the adjutant of the 4th Corps in Dresden, would be my successor. I will speak to the commander-in-chief about it in the next few days. But now it is time we packed up for the day. At the beginning of November, the commander of 11th Corps on the left wing of the army, General of Infantry Strecker, came to speak to Paulus personally. All the divisions on the northern front reported movements and concentrations of enemy troops in front of our left flank and the Romanian Third Army, which had been inserted between the 6th Army and the Italian 8th Army on the 10th October. Strecker demanded urgent countermeasures as the 4th Panzer Army operating in the south had identified attack preparations by the enemy. Paulus was shattered by such a false appraisal. The crude reprimand injured him. The general staff must know what is about to happen, he said strongly. Are there then only yes men in Hitler's entourage approving every nonsense? But then he fell quiet. The commander-in-chief of the 6th Army did not want to confine himself to an independent decision. Military obedience won over reason. An army reserve would be formed and placed ready behind the 11th Corps west of the Don southeast of Kletskaya. It was to consist of a mixed band of regimental strength, at whose core would be a tank hunting unit of the 14th Panzer Division, divisional headquarters, a panzer regiment, a tank hunting unit, an artillery regiment, and part of the signals unit. Next day I was at a conference with General Paulus. Almost without looking at it, the commander-in-chief thanked me for my report. His eyes were fixed on the situation map lying before him on the table. May I ask, General, how the situation on our left flank has changed since yesterday? I asked him. Much worse. The attitude of the Army High Command is simply incomprehensible to me. They imagine at headquarters, at a distance of more than 2,000 kilometers, that they can better assess the situation at the front than we can. That is absurd. Such a disregard of the enemy is unique. If the Army High Command does not take measures to protect our flanks soon, it could cost the whole of the 6th Army. It is not just us signaling ever more clear indications of a counterattack. The 4th Panzer Army is seeing the same things on its front. That should alarm the people at Führer headquarters. Why doesn't the Army Chief of the General Staff come and see us himself? Here, the threatening danger cannot be turned away with speeches. I think so too, Adam, but this journey seems to put everyone off. Zitzler would hardly dare to contradict Hitler. He delivered the proof of this yesterday. How can a chief of the general staff pass on such orders? And that was personal too. Hitler booted Halder out of his company, the last general who at least had his own opinions on military matters. In relation to the political aim setting, there are no differences between Hitler and his generals. Apparently, Hitler only wants collaborators like Keitel, who says yes to everything. The future will show whether Zitzler went along with this illusionary strategy or whether he correctly assessed the strength and possibilities of the Red Army. After a few seconds, he turned pensively. Let us hope that everything will go well for once. By the beginning of October, it was obvious to us at Army headquarters that we would not be able to take Stalingrad with our badly hit divisions before winter set in. This brought some consequences. One of these was the redeployment of the Army headquarters. Golubinskaya, on the west bank of the Don between the bridges at Kalach and Peskovaka, had an unsuitable traffic situation. It also lacked a connection to the railway, and one could hardly speak of any sort of traffic system. After a reconnaissance sortie for a suitable headquarters, the choice fell on Nizhny. The railway from the west ended not far away, and direct roads led from here to the subordinate corps. All this spoke for Nizhny becoming the Army's winter headquarters. In the first days of November, the Army's Chief of Signals reported that communications to the Court and Army Group had been established. The officers' mess and accommodation had been secured under the direction of the headquarters commandant, and I had checked out the prepared complex on the orders of the Commander-in-Chief. It was actually far better and more suitable than Golubinskaya. The little town at the mouth of the Chur on the Don gave a clean, cared-for impression. Whitewashed single- or two-story houses stood on the edge of wide streets. Gardens and yards completed the picture of the town. Almost all the houses were empty, as most of the inhabitants had left the place. Although all preparations for the move had been made, the Chief of Staff hesitated to set a date. Schmidt feared that moving back the Army headquarters from Golubinskaya to Nizhny would have an adverse effect on the morale of the hard-fighting troops in the front line. Therefore, it was planned that the move would take place at short notice, the first to go to the winter headquarters, being part of the command section in the Army Signals Regiment. The senior quartermaster's department would remain as before near Kalach on the railway line to Stalingrad. After crossing the Don, the supply situation for the 6th Army tapered off considerably. Only one railway line was available for bringing forward fuel, ammunition, and supplies. This came from the west via Morozovsk and the Don Bridge near Richkov to Stalingrad. However, the railway bridge had been blown, so that all the supplies had to be unloaded onto trucks at Chur Station and driven just over the bridge near Verkhnechirskaya, before being reloaded onto the railway wagons already waiting there. One can easily understand how complicated and time-consuming this was. Often the railway track was blocked by either empty wagons or hospital trains, creating blockages, tearing the stream of vital supplies apart. How would it be when winter came? If additional warm clothing, heating material, and fodder for horses had to be delivered, if there were also deep snowdrifts and black ice? These questions brought up other anxious concerns. In the middle of October, the Quartermaster General of the Army, Lieutenant General Wagner, visited 6th Army headquarters. He wanted to see for himself how the supplies were organized and how the whole supply system could be improved. But he too could not help. Our new 1st General Staff Officer, Colonel Elchlev, told me afterwards that Wagner had talked about the conditions at Führer headquarters. All the generals avoided contradicting Hitler. All feared the hysterical outburst of this lofty dictator. Wagner himself had informed the Supreme Commander in the summer of 1942 about the lack of sources of fuel and requested the supply situation be brought into consideration in the planning of operations. Afterwards, Hitler had let him go with the words, "I had not expected another answer from my generals, thank you." We had already often heard such accounts. How did that help us? Not at all. The generals complained about Hitler, but they went on playing the game with him. With their tactical assistance, that hysterical man could continue pursuing the war. The generals might be contemptuous of the Bohemian corporal, but the fact was that they had worked on his war plans, that with them he had gone from one adventure to another, driving millions of people senselessly to their deaths. In that lay the historical and human blame of the generals in the Second World War. I have been rushing ahead with this recognition of my own development. In those days of October 1942, I was still a long way from such a recognition. I had a feeling that something was not quite right about the whole mechanism of the Wehrmacht command. Sometimes I became angry about so much amateurism, sometimes quite depressed by it. But I did what I took to be my duty. Having myself started off with the military tradition and education, the thought that Paulus, as Commander-in-Chief of the 6th Army, had initiated disaster through his own independent decisions was then far from me. One of the explanations for this was that in October 1942, I had hardly yet reached hell's front door. I had to go right through the inferno of Stalingrad to obtain a deeper understanding. But I will discuss this later. Among the supply problems that the 6th Army had to concern itself with as the 1942-43 winter approached was the securing of fodder for the thousands of horses. General Paulus decided therefore that all dispensable horses should be moved to the rear army area west of the Don. Only those absolutely necessary for the artillery regiments, the infantry gun companies, and the medical services would remain. All the rest were marched off to the west and stabled in villages in which sufficient supplies of food, stalls, and barns were available. This was a risky business. The divisions lost their essential transport. But what else could one do if one was not to leave the animals to starve? That these measures might later contribute to our starving thousands of German soldiers no one considered at the time. In order to save transport space, most of the tanks were also brought to the army's rear area. It had been shown that they were not suitable for the house-to-house fighting within the city. The northern and southern fronts were stuck in a battle for positions. Almost all the tanks, those that had not been totally destroyed, needed major repairs. In order to reduce the demands on fuel, spare parts, and equipment, the Army headquarters had ordered that the tanks be pulled out of the front and moved back to the area west of the Don for restoration. The workshop companies had already taken up their assigned winter quarters. In view of the bad omens on the northern and southern fronts, there were no more transfers of the panzer regiments. At the end of October, the land between the Don and the Volga lay under thick fog all day long. The reconnaissance activity of the Luftwaffe was completely immobilized. We had no exact picture of what the enemy was up to. At last came a few clear autumnal days, offering good visibility. The first flights over the area on the northern flank confirmed what our divisions had reported from their observations. Excitedly, we pored over the aerial photographs. The Red Army had strongly extended their bridgeheads over the Don, especially in the area of Serafimovich. Several new bridges had been erected, some of them underwater bridges whose surface lay beneath the water level so as to reduce their visibility. We were standing near Colonel Elchlep in front of the big situation map. From the north, from about Voronezh, the front line followed the Don generally eastwards, crossed it south, and reached the Volga north of Rheinak. This enormous, 600-kilometer-long flank was held by just two of our corps and the badly equipped armies of our allies. The run of the front south of Stalingrad looked no calmer. A mighty hole gaped between the 4th Panzer Army and the Romanian 4th Army, the right-hand neighbor of the 6th Army, and the German units in the Caucasus. On a front-line sector of about 400 kilometers stood the widely dispersed 16th Motorized Infantry Division. Not unjustifiably, it bore the nickname of the Steppe Fire Brigade. Parallel to this, the enemy front was shown as a red line on the map. In front of the 6th Army's left flank and the Romanian 3rd Army, as well as in front of the right wing of the 4th Panzer Army, was shown a mass of Soviet units. General Paulus put one hand on the northern mass of enemy troops, the other on the southern, and then he pushed his hands together as if shutting a trap. What lay inside the trap? What was cut off by the arms of the trap was us, our 6th Army. Elchlep commented laconically, "If Hitler whistles at our proposals again in this dangerous situation, the catastrophe is complete." The nervous tension among the army staff increased. After supper, I escorted Paulus to his quarters. Both of us hardly noticed when we left the village street. Nevertheless, a little later we were standing on the bank of the Don. For a short time our eyes roved over the surface of the water. Then Paulus broke the silence. "You know my request, Adam. Hitler has rejected everything. The suspension of the fighting in Stalingrad and the release of the 14th Panzer Corps from the city. He went through the orders given to me at Vinica on the 12th September and demanded the speeding up of the taking of the city by all means. That way we bleed, but that is not all. Stalingrad could become the 6th Army's cannon." The last sentence seemed as if he had spoken to himself. For several minutes he stood sunk in thought, as if he had forgotten me. Then he stroked his brow with his right hand as if he wanted to brush away the tormenting thoughts. His thin figure stretched itself. "Let us concern ourselves with what we can do. When will the first young officers be available? You know how urgently we need them. Dozens of companies are being led by non-commissioned officers. I was in Suvorovsky yesterday. At first, the young cadets were not happy about being transferred to the infantry, but now their hearts are all for it. Captain Gobel also reported that they were making good progress. I can confirm that from my own impressions. Unfortunately, the course had a late start. We can finish at the end of the month at the earliest. In addition, The taking over command by Colonel Abraham at Suvorovsky has worked out well. His original humor and his rich experiences are priceless. With this, he has regained his health himself. I regret today that I agreed to a later ending of the course. See to it that whatever happens, they are ready by the 30th November. We directed our steps back to the village. It was becoming frosty. Was this only due to the cool of the evening, or was this a terrible warning? At headquarters, the usual reports were set out. Nothing unusual there, still nothing. At 10 p.m. hours, the connection to the court became available. There were casualty reports, decorations, promotions, officer postings. Always the same, I thought. Among the ruins of the Volga city in the middle of November, I had some business to do with the 71st Infantry Division. One of its regimental commanders, Colonel Rosk, was an old acquaintance of mine. Until the outbreak of the war, we had both been teachers of tactics at the war school in Dresden. Now Rosk was with his staff in Stalingrad, his regiment right on the bank of the Volga. I accompanied him there. Seeing the devastated state of the city for the first time from bombing and close quarter fighting, Schiller's words came to me. Horror lives in the empty window frames. Ruins, nothing but ruins, in the cellars, among them huddled soldiers. Bomb craters and heaps of rubble made the once smooth street virtually impassable. Glass splinters, window casemates, bits of machines, wrecked cars, bedding, remains of furniture, cooking utensils, stoves, electricity cables, tram cables, an inconceivable jumble of destroyed and damaged objects of all kinds. Rosk and I moved forward only with difficulty. No one could say exactly where the front line ran in this rubble. Enemy troops could appear suddenly behind our soldiers at any time. Death lay behind every ruin and at every crossroads. Rosk was a good guide through the rubble, dust and glass splinters. After about half an hour, the view opened up. We were standing in a covered trench on the western, steeply falling bank of the Volga. The mighty stream was more than 2 kilometers wide. It looked almost like a lake and was a bit misty. Only if one strained one's eyes hard could one faintly see the outline of the far bank. To the right of us, a big wooded island appeared in the middle of the powerful stream. Its southern end attracted our attention. Rosk said that during the night our sentries had been pushed back to the Volga bank. Now there was no ship, no boat to be seen on the water. Some German pilots who were keeping a watch over the river had nothing to do. The dive bombers had more to do, diving steeply on the east bank and the island, their targets being enemy mortars and troop concentrations. They fired their cannon as they dropped their bombs. I stood astounded at the enormous dimensions of the river landscape. After the broad expanse of the steppe came the width of the river, then the city. It had 600,000 inhabitants, the factory workers alone amounting to 10,000. What a life there must have been here on Europe's mightiest river between the Caucasus and Moscow. The taking of machine gun fire interrupted my thoughts. Hand grenades exploded to our left, and then, with dull thuds, the artillery joined in the battle. While we were standing here in the protection of the trench, bodies were being torn apart by the shelling only a few dozen meters away. Suddenly, all was quiet again. It is often like this. The regimental commander's voice sounded next to me. A short exchange of fire, mostly in connection with some troop activity or other. Complete silence reigns over the Volga by day, but it becomes much livelier as dusk approaches. With the field glasses, you can see Krasnaya Sloboda over there. Our bombers have blasted the village umpteen times, but no sooner do the first signs of dusk appear on the river than the boats are loaded with men and supplies. The Russians try to cross over to the west bank in the darkness of the night. Then comes a tremendous spectacle. Flares throw their magical light over the water, and searchlights slide their beams over the surface of the river. Should a ship or a boat be discovered, it is bathed in light and shot at by machine guns and guns of all kinds. Aircraft appear, drop their bombs, and dive down firing their cannon. Nevertheless, most boats reach the bank. From prisoner of war statements, we know that in the middle of October, a whole rifle division was transported across in a single night. The Russians only reduced their river traffic in bright moonlight. Rosk's regiment was involved in the close quarter fighting, together with the whole of the 71st Infantry Division and its neighbors to the left and right. While returning to this command post, my companion described the struggle. Assault troops from the division to our left forced their way into a building and threw the Russians out of the ground floor. The enemy is still sitting in the floor above today. For days now, our people have been pursuing the fighting with all their might, but have been unable to drive Ivan out. It is puzzling how he is supplied. He should have been starved out long ago and shot himself. But no, that handful of Russians has no interest in surrendering. They did not even think about it in the following weeks. This small, brave garrison held out until the German troops in this part of the city had been smashed or taken prisoner. We later discovered, from the Soviet history of the war, that this was Sergeant Pavlov's team. The Army High Command permits defensive measures on the northern flank. Paulus had applied yet again to the Army High Command for permission to abandon Stalingrad and withdraw the 6th Army behind the Don. Again, his application was rejected. The attack to the death of the exhausted divisions was gradually assured. Our troops had reached the end of their strength. The last attacks in November had to be paid for with the lives of thousands, and further thousands were crippled. Only a few square meters of ruins had been gained by these attacks. The taking of the city was postponed indefinitely. But the repeated requests obtained one result from the Army High Command, which at last approved some defensive measures on the 6th Army's northern flank. The 48th Panzer Corps, inserted on the 6th Army's right wing in the city, finally handed over 2 of its divisions to the Corps. With its 3 divisions, the 29th, Motorized Infantry Division, became the reserve for Army Group B. Its now superfluous Corps headquarters was moved to the rear of the Romanian 3rd Army, and the 22nd Panzer Division and the Romanian 1st Tank Division were placed under its command. The commanding general of the 48th Panzer Corps was Lieutenant General Wilhelm, the former Chief of Staff of the 6th Army and an officer with whom I had long enjoyed working. Wilhelm was to act as a corset to the Romanian 3rd Army threatened by the enemy's attack preparations. General Paulus did not expect much from this. His mistrust lay not with the commanding general, but with the troops under him. The Romanian 1st Tank Division, he said to me, is equipped only with light French and Setch tanks. The men are not fully trained and have never been in battle. The German 22nd Panzer Division was badly decimated in the consequent fighting. Wilhelm can only have part of the remainder. Half of the Panzer Regiment has been deployed elsewhere by Army Group B. Obviously, the limited protective measures from Führer headquarters could in no way banish the most earnest worries of the Commander-in-Chief and the Chief of Staff. I discussed this with Paulus on the 15th November. The Chief of Staff was again referring to Lieutenant General Wilhelm's task. I regard it as more than superfluous if anyone believes that Wilhelm can prevent a breakthrough by the Russians with his 2 half divisions. When will the Wehrmacht High Command and the Army High Command finally learn to gauge the strength of the enemy correctly? Then you too regard as insufficient the defensive strengths that you, General, have placed ready behind our left flank. Of course they are insufficient. That is why I sought permission to extract the 14th Panzer Corps from the Stalingrad front. The Army High Command also turned that down, even though the tanks in the city are virtually unused. I simply don't get it, General. Such false decisions are already provoking a catastrophe. Don't condemn so harshly, Adam. The 14th Panzer Corps has received orders from me to pull back the Panzer regiments and anti-tank battalions of the 16th and 14th Panzer Corps, so that on demand they can immediately go to the left flank west of the Don. And what is going to happen in the south? Would the 4th Panzer Army hold if the Russians break out? Apparently, there is hardly anything left of the Panzer Army. It also has had to give up all its tanks and its infantry division. It still has the Romanian infantry divisions, which have fought bravely several times, but they are poorly armed and equipped. Everything depends upon the strength of the enemy. Should he attack with large battle-strong units, it could also be catastrophic in the south. I too fear the worst if the High Command does not produce battle-strength divisions as soon as possible, but we cannot let any panic break out. I fully understand that, but are we going to look on while doing nothing as the noose is drawn around our necks, General? Our divisions simply cannot do any more. Many of them do not even have half their fighting establishments. All these statements are of no help to us, Adam. Think of the many different situations we have already been through this year. Above all, you know the orders of the Army High Command. They are binding for me as a soldier. From my subordinates, I too demand that they carry out their orders unconditionally." With this, our talk came to an end. Our concerns remained, especially for Paulus. He worked restlessly, checking, visiting, speaking. He demanded the utmost from himself, but did not change his mind in doing so. The fate of the Sixth Army was decided at Führer headquarters, and Paulus had accepted his orders. The first snow fell on the 16th November. The wind whistled icily over the steppe. It found no resistance, and our light field gray coats, forage caps, and dice boxes were not suitable protection against the cold. Really, one should have learnt from the nasty experiences of the winter of 1941 to 1942. But by the middle of November, the Sixth Army still had no adequate winter clothing. Paulus had already ordered it, as he had known that operating within the city would not be complete before the cold set in. The Army's quartermaster general shared the view of our commander-in-chief. On the other hand, Hitler was of the opinion that normal winter clothing would suffice on the Eastern Front, especially since the National Socialist People's Welfare was ready with a grandiose collection of winter items, to which every member of the public had contributed, to be sent through to the soldiers on the Eastern Front. In fact, the population was prepared to contribute anything, no matter what articles of clothing, against the cold and icy wind. Enormous crates were filled with them, but the cold period had come to Stalingrad so suddenly that hardly any of the collection had reached the front, and not much got to the rear areas either. The Army Quartermaster General tried to get the delivery expedited, but with little success, the transport facilities being so limited and the overwhelming distances so great. From Milerovo, the main source of supply for the Sixth Army, it was reported that a paradoxical picture had emerged when the first wagon of winter clothing was opened. Instead of the requisite woolen and knitted items, there were hundreds of ladies' coats, muffs, Persian capes, and other fur items, including some very expensive ones that were, however, completely useless at the front. Apparently, the items of clothing handed in by the civilian population had not been secured and checked, but simply dispatched without evaluation. Did the troops want to see what they could get? Schmidt exploded over this mess-up, but he could not change anything. Those responsible were somewhere warm at home, 2,000 kilometers away from Stalingrad. The divisional quartermasters received instructions to issue the few good items available to the fighting troops. This barely sufficed to clothe even a fifth of our soldiers huddling in the shelter trenches and bunkers of the northern front without stoves, without fuel, in the middle of the snow-covered steppe, swept by the biting northeasterly winds. While this was going on, the alarming reports arriving at Army headquarters were growing. Our nerves were stretched to breaking point. There was no doubt that the Soviet offensive was imminent. What would happen if the 11th Corps and the Romanian 5th Army failed to hold their positions? The telephone rattled the storm. I was shaken out of my sleep. But before I could grasp the telephone, I heard a distant rumbling. Drum fire, I thought. The duty officer called, "Alarm, Colonel," to the Chief of Staff immediately. That was the beginning of the Soviet counteroffensive. The calendar showed 19th November 1942. I put on my uniform tunic and boots and rushed to the headquarters section. Officers and soldiers were already gathering as if they had been torn from their sleep. The Chief of Staff, Major General Schmidt, had already put the whole army on alert. It was extremely serious. The tiring days of waiting, during which our gunners and tank crews lay beside their guns, were over. Our infantry loaded their machine guns for automatic fire and grasped their hand grenades, which lay ready within reach. Shortly afterwards, the Army Commander-in-Chief appeared beside Schmidt. The telephone rang. General Strecker, commander of the 11th Corps, reported, "All hell's broken loose. An unimaginable drumfire is falling on our positions. The ground is being literally plowed up. We have enormous numbers of casualties. The main blow appears to have hit the Romanians." I telephoned my left-hand neighbors, the Romanian 4th Corps. Their commander was really pessimistic. He fears panic breaking out among his troops. Our divisions are at their posts, but can hardly see anything through the snow. We will keep Army headquarters informed. Paulus gave Strecker the following briefing. To ensure the safety of your left flank, send the 14th Panzer Division southwest of Kletskaya. Go as close as you can as soon as the direction of the enemy attack is identified. Paulus put the telephone down, looked at us silently for a moment, then picked up the telephone again. "Connect me with Army Group B." An officer on the staff of the Army Group took the first report from the 6th Army about the enemy's artillery preparation. From then on, the ringing of the telephone in the Chief of Staff's room hardly stopped. Reports, questions, orders chased each other. The withdrawal from the city of the 14th Panzer Corps was prepared. The Army High Command was informed by its liaison officer to the 6th Army, Major von Zitzewitz, who had relieved Major Menzel. But as yet we still did not know enough about the enemy's intentions and direction of attack. At about 7 a.m. General Strecker reported again. "The enemy has gone into the attack from the bridgehead. We have been able to hold on to our position so far. The thrust is directed at the Romanian 3rd Army. The 376th Infantry Division informs us that the Russians have broken through the positions of the Romanian 4th Corps and are pushing south with tanks. The situation with the Romanian 1st Cavalry Division is completely unknown. It no longer has connection with its left-hand neighbor. I will pull back the 376th Infantry Division and put it to protect our flank with its front facing west. The telephone connection with the 44th Infantry Division has been destroyed. A motorcyclist reports that the shelling has almost destroyed the foremost positions. The Red tanks have crushed everything the Romanians had." Paulus authorized the withdrawal of the 376th Infantry Division to a flanking position, ordering cooperation with the 14th Panzer Division, and attached the Romanian 1st Cavalry Division, which had been pushed eastwards, to the 11th Corps. From Army Group B, we learned that the Soviet artillery had been firing thousands of tons of steel at the Romanian 3rd Army's positions for hours. Then 2 shock armies broke out of the bridgehead near Kletskaya and Serafimovich. The Romanians had defended themselves bravely, but were overrun and forced to flee. At this moment, Soviet tank units carrying infantry and some cavalry units were thrusting unstoppably further south. Neither German nor Romanian command posts could say where the enemy spearheads were. Only one thing was certain: the 6th Army was already under threat from the rear. My attempts to get an idea of how many casualties the 11th Corps had suffered were equally unsuccessful. The court adjutant informed me that the telephone lines had been almost continuously broken since very early morning. In his opinion, the 44th and 376th Infantry Divisions must have suffered severe casualties. For the Army headquarters staff, the 19th November passed in anxious waiting. Catastrophic reports piled up hour after hour. Although by evening we still had no precise knowledge of the extent of the Soviet success, it was obvious to all of us that we were in deadly danger. At about 7 p.m., I went to Paulus for a conference. He was pacing back and forth, bent over, across the room. That he was more nervous than usual showed on his face. He stopped in front of me. "Now has happened what I have been forecasting for weeks. Hitler does not want to accept as true what every simple soldier can see. Keitel and Jodl have supported him in this. For weeks we have had nothing but empty words. Now we have to dish out the soup. We have no idea if it is possible to stop the Russian counteroffensive." I nodded wordlessly, tormented by the same thoughts. Angrily, Paulus went on. "The danger confronting us is gigantic. I see only one way out of this situation. Turning away to the southwest. The fastest action is necessary." This was also my opinion, so I asked, "In this case, must the Army really ask for a decision from the Army High Command? Here we are talking about the lives of almost 330,000 men. Even if it is to be or not to be, the whole of the 6th Army goes. I have, as you know, asked to abandon Stalingrad. That was refused. There is still the order whereby no commander of an army group or an army has the right to relinquish a village, even a trench, without Hitler's consent. Of course, the decision of every army commander has been paralyzed. But how will we get through the war if orders are no longer complied with? What effect would this have on the troops? However large the command of a general is, the men must be given an example of this soldier's obedience to orders. This basic attitude also determined Paulus's conduct in the weeks to come. Even though the necessity of independent action was still compelling, Paulus did not even consider it. He remained an obedient general. In this he was backed by his temperamental, but also fanatical, Chief of Staff, Major General Schmidt, and most of the commanding generals. I too despite many inner conflicts over these painful but also consequential considerations, failed to stand out. During the night of the 19th and 20th November, the Army staff obtained a clearer picture of the situation. The 14th Panzer Division reported that the enemy had thrust about 30 kilometers into the hinterland with tanks and cavalry. Their artillery regiment had repulsed several strong attacks. Fresh news from the 11th Corps indicated that the Romanians had been attacked by strong tank units without offering any serious resistance, the tanks simply mowing down anything that stood in their way. Those Romanians still alive fled desperately to the south and east. The Romanian Third Army did not appear to exist anymore. Also, many of our rear services had suffered a hard shock from the enemy storming south before them. Clearly, no one on the staff could think of sleeping that night. All the section heads were assembled in Schmidt's office. Without any sign of internal excitement, he described the new situation west of the Don and finished with these words. The move of the Army headquarters to Nizhny is to be prepared. Orders have yet to come about the destruction of dispensable files, especially the secret ones. Schmidt's optimism and bubbling energy in this situation contrasted especially with Paulus's heavy sense of responsibility. To the Chief of Staff, the internal conflict of his commander-in-chief was alien. Schmidt was in his element, making decisions, issuing orders, and controlling their execution. He was convinced that it would be possible to defeat the enemy despite the Russians' considerable initial success on the battlefield. He spread General Paulus' proposal, which he had worked on with the 1st General Staff Officer. It went, the 14th Panzer Corps with the panzer regiments of the 16th and 24th Panzer Divisions must reach the west bank of the Don, then strike the forces of the Red Army advancing from the heights west of Golubinskaya in the flank and destroy them. The staff of the 14th Panzer Corps will take over the Army's command post in Golubinskaya. The 14th Panzer Division will also be attached to it. The assault troop activities in the city are to cease immediately. All available troops on the fronts of the 8th Corps will be withdrawn as reserves for the 6th Army. The bridgehead on the west bank of the Don west of Kalach will be reinforced by the engineer and anti-aircraft artillery courses with all dispensable troops from the rear services and placed under command of Colonel Mikosh. The officer cadet school in Suvorovsky is to be ready to move. Army headquarters will move on the 21st November to Nizhny. Colonel Adam is responsible for the move. Wounded and not required supply troops will be moved to the area south of Chur, where the Russian attack is threatening the railway line and with it the main supply route. Paulus approved this proposal. The orders were prepared and distributed to the units. Midnight was long past, and no new reports were expected before daybreak. For the moment, there was nothing to do at Army headquarters, so I escorted Paulus to his quarters. On the way, he started talking. If Führer headquarters had allowed my proposal to withdraw the 6th Army behind the Don, we would have been spared this difficult crisis. Hopefully, Hitler and his entourage have now at least some understanding and will order the city to be abandoned. That is no longer easy today with the whole of the Romanian Third Army knocked out of the Don front. The Russian tank and cavalry units have practically no one in front of them. I have little faith that Heim's 48th Panzer Corps can bring this thrust to a halt. If you are expecting such an order from Führer headquarters, General, it would be expedient to start preparatory measures. Temporarily, I have proposed to Army Group pulling out all the troops from the city. Obviously, I cannot let this intention become known to the troops yet. That would only cause panic, and at the very least lead to a reduction in the will to resist. The Corps staff are already busy dealing with this question. At least it must be clear to them that the orders signed by me previously have the aim of extracting the army from the threatened encirclement. We had reached the commander-in-chief's accommodation. I excused myself and went back to my section. When I entered the room, Senior Sergeant Major Kepper got up from his desk. The other clerks were already asleep. So, Kepper, you are already up. We can get on with the work. It is already done, Colonel. You think so? You will be surprised. We will prepare all the dispensable files, especially the secret ones, for destruction. The remainder will be packed. The staff moves to Nizhny tomorrow. Ah, so that's the truth of it. Yesterday I heard of it from various Corps dispatch riders. One from the 11th Corps said that the Russians had overrun the Romanians and pushed suddenly to the south. I took that for just a latent rumor, but when I heard an hour later that you were still with the chief of staff, I sensed nothing good. That is why I am still awake. It must look very bad if we are already burning the files. Don't throw the flint into the corn yet. First of all, we must be careful. We will wait to see what today brings. Let the others sleep in peace. We will do the work ourselves. The senior sergeant major pulled the steel box containing the secret files from under the camp bed, opened it and gave me the papers one by one. I divided them into two heaps, papers that had to be destroyed when danger threatened, and those that were less secret, such as recommendations for awards, leave approvals, and so on. After this, the stacks of paper were bundled up and put back in the box. As we were finishing, the day was already beginning to dawn. Go and get some sleep now, Kepper. I am going to my quarters to wash and shave myself. I will be back here at 8 a.m. at the latest. Attack also from the south. Half an hour later, I was standing shaving in front of the mirror in my bedroom. The telephone rang. What could have happened? I thought, as I pressed the telephone to my ear. Come immediately to the chief of staff. General Paulus is already here. I quickly finished shaving and hurried to the command section. The wind was cutting in my face and into my skin under the not winterproof clothing. Individual snowflakes settled on the field gray or ran down the chin and cheeks. In Schmidt's room, a large white chalk clay farm stove maintained a pleasant temperature. The commander-in-chief was standing with the chief of staff before the map hanging on the wall. The depiction of the latest situation had begun. I stared bewitched at the entries. In the 4th Panzer Army's area was a thick red arrow going through its forward positions. The Soviet army had also entered from a southerly direction. Paulus pulled it all together. The enemy early this morning, after a strong artillery preparation, attacked the positions of the 4th Panzer Army and the Romanian 4th Army. The situation there at the moment is not clear. The Red Army is pursuing its attack from the north here. Its left-hand group is going in a southeasterly direction on Verchin-Busimka. We must therefore reckon that the 11th Corps' route to the south will be blocked within a few hours. The greatest danger lies here with the railway line from Morozovsk to Chir Station. So we were right up to our necks in it. The Soviet High Command was pressing both fangs together. We tried to prevent this with a counterattack by the 14th Corps and the 48th Panzer Corps. But what if this attempt failed? What if our armored forces proved too weak? Then the enemy would tighten the noose and the 6th Army would be caught in a cauldron. I paced my little office restlessly, 3 steps forward, 3 steps back. When I tried to relax, my thoughts immediately returned to the situation map. The red attack arrows threatened nightmarishly. Upon extension, they would meet near Kalach. But something must happen. Would our panzer regiments attack in time to remove the threat to the rear of the 6th Army? What would the next few hours bring? The answer came more quickly than I would have liked. Paulus had me summoned. I entered a room that was dense with cigarette smoke and hung with thick blue clouds. The ashtrays on the tables were full to the top. Among them, still untouched, stood a cup of black coffee. You know, Adam, that Major General Basler took over the 14th Panzer Division a few weeks ago. Today, the general has reported sick. Apparently, it's an old heart problem that has come up again. He asked my permission to drive back to the homeland. I have agreed. A commander who reports sick in this situation is useless and becomes a burden to the troops. This well-nourished gentleman was already unsympathetic when I saw him for the first time. Nevertheless, I would not have believed that he would leave his troops in the lurch in this dangerous situation. That is desertion. This is to make it clear that we must leave it to the army group. I have informed them of the foregoing. General Basler was in such a hurry that he should soon be with them. The 14th Panzer Division reported to Schmidt that Basler was already on the way in his car to Chir Station. He has not even considered it necessary to wait for the arrival of his replacement, a shame that he should be a general. Basler is not only an officer who forgets his duty. The day before yesterday, with the first reports of enemy activity, he became afraid and failed to spare his troops unnecessary casualties. A courier officer from the 14th Panzer Division told me that there was a serious dispute between the bestseller and his staff. I am not taken in by his sickness. In soldiers' language, this rates as cowardice. The gentleman is concerned about his precious life. Do we wait for the investigation? The personnel office will see to it. I want to know from them who the successor is. The division must still have a new commander today. Presuming that Major General Schmidt is agreeable, I propose Colonel Lattman, commander of the Armored Artillery Regiment of the 16th Panzer Division. I consider him one of the most capable officers in this army. He is clever, agile, circumspect, and energetic. Lattman knows the armor to his fingertips, which in this complicated situation is especially important. Once Schmidt had accepted my proposal, Paulus too gave his approval. The Army Personnel Office was requested by teleprinters to permit this change of command of the 14th Panzer Division. A few hours later, Colonel Lattman reported to the Army staff in Golubinskaya. The Chief of Staff briefed him on the situation. The new divisional commander was not envied for his task. The 14th Panzer Division had already suffered considerable losses in the defensive fighting. Above all, its artillery regiment had been literally shot up by the enemy's tanks. Hours of unrest and uncertainty. We lived through hours of unrest and uncertainty. Rumors of all kinds were circulating. No one knew where they came from. No one knew what was really happening. Had the enemy really interrupted the Don High Road to Chur Station? Was it correct that he had reached the railway line from Morozovsk to the Don, that the 4th Panzer Army had been defeated? What measures had the Army High Command initiated to fight the rear of the 6th Army free? Where was the 48th Panzer Corps hiding? Had it attacked? With what results? Our nerves were at breaking point. At last, on the evening of the 20th November, we had some information about the situation with our right-hand neighbor, the 4th Panzer Army. The enemy had broken through its defensive line from the south and was thrusting westwards towards the Don. The 29th Motorized Infantry Division was tasked by the Army Group with blocking the breakthrough, but was incapable of stopping the attack. The 4th Corps and the Romanian 20th Infantry Division had been brushed aside and were now positioned with their front facing south. Nothing was known of the other Romanian division in the south. According to the latest reports, the Soviet tanks were standing close in front of the 4th Panzer Army's headquarters. That was a fine mess. A gaping hole on our left flank and now also on the right. The enemy thrust with ever stronger forces through our shattered front. His attacking spearheads were rapidly getting closer, and we had no reserves with which to repulse this deadly danger. From Army Group, we learned that the counterattack by the weakened 48th Panzer Corps under Lieutenant General Heim had been easily checked. Our Luftwaffe, which perhaps could have relieved the situation, had been rendered inoperable by snowfalls. The Soviet tanks had reached the Liskado from the north and were storming towards Kalach. Another group was rattling further south. The only supply railway coming from the west via Morozovsk to the Don and ending at Chur was under immediate threat. For the enemy, the way south as far as the mouth of the Don at the Azov Lake was virtually open. That meant nothing less than that sooner or later the Russians would find themselves in the rear of Army Group A, which was composed of the 1st Panzer Army and the 17th Army, and was operating in the Caucasus. Every one of us knew that we were confronting a catastrophe of inconceivable extent if the German side did not act quickly and powerfully. How could it be managed?